Sally Helgesen, welcome back to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thank you, Howard. It's wonderful to be with you this morning.
Yeah, let's talk about DEI, which I think is diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And those are capital letters.
Exactly. I've been writing about it recently because there's been such a sort of political backlash to the efforts in organizations of all kinds, whether corporate, university, association. There's been a real backlash to the efforts that companies have made to extend their leadership, to open the leadership and open the development of all kinds of people, a wide variety of people. And there's some political opportunism in trying to blame every single problem that exists on diversity and inclusion. And I've just been exploring why this is such a wrong-headed approach.
Yeah, so let's begin, folks who haven't met you yet. Can you kind of just introduce yourself so you can kind of ground the topic in your own experience and expertise?
Of course, Sally. I'm Sally Helgesen, and I have been working with writing about and researching and speaking about and doing workshops on both women's leadership and inclusive leadership for 35 years now, and written 8 books in the field. The book I wrote, The Web of Inclusion, A New Architecture for Building Great Organizations, in 1995, was the first time the language of inclusion had been used in the workplace. And it was not at that time at all related to diversity, because diversity and inclusion didn't exist as a thing. But I was just advocating for more inclusive practices that would help organizations engage and retain a broader spectrum of people and really use their talents to the utmost. So these topics, women's leadership and inclusive leadership, have been really my passion for decades. So this has to do with the focus that I've had in my newsletters since the start of the year on the value of DEI, why it's not going away, although the name and how we talk about it may change.
Okay. So I'm curious, when you started writing about it, as you said, it wasn't even a thing. Like, you had to lend it words so that it, became something that people could talk about. Now, DEI had become a sort of a department or an initiative in HR. It then became, a punching bag of certain political and cultural aspects. I'm just curious how your work has been affected by the kind of the concept of DEI escaping into the wild, where you can't control the narrative anymore. Has it changed what you do in organizations in any way?
It has not changed what I do in organizations. And that's one of the points that I'm trying to make. This whole idea that diversity and inclusion is inherently just a politically correct program is ridiculous. Diversity is not a goal. Diversity is the nature of the workforce. It's the nature of the talent pool that global organizations have to work with. And inclusion is a way to lead and manage effectively a diverse workforce. So D&I has been really just an approach to address an issue in organizations, which is the increasing diversity. And I'm talking about certainly race, culture, gender, sexual identification, age. We have such a huge age span now in the workplace, and as well as values and experience. So how do you lead that effectively? How do you develop talent given that reality? That's a very different question than is being addressed by political opportunists who are basically saying, oh, this is wokeism and et cetera, and this is responsible for every bad thing that's happening, whether it's, airline wheels coming off or, technological glitches. Let's look at D&I as the problem. We saw it really blow up at the beginning of the year with the firing of the presidents of Harvard and Penn State, and now they're going after president of MIT.
Gotcha. So so there's lots of sort of noise and firecrackers about it, but I try to read works by sort of thoughtful conservatives and people of color who are not sort of lockstep in with my sort of knee-jerk liberal take on things. And one of them is John McWhorter, who is a Columbia University linguistics professor and a columnist for the New York Times. And he had a column right after Claudine Gay, the ex-president of Harvard, resigned, in which he said, it's not racism. And he said, but is it racism to question why she was chosen with a relatively skinny resume of scholarship compared to other people that in a past era that might have been referred to as tokenism, which he would say is as bad or worse. And so one of the points he made in this opinion piece is that capital DEI has an ideology behind it that's not the same as wanting those things: diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm wondering if you agree that there's a place to parse the sort of a philosophical underpinnings of capital D, capital E, capital I, and the way it's been presented in organizations, and the goals, or do they have to go together?
Yeah, and McWhorter is someone I read, and I also, like you, read thoughtful conservatives, not knee-jerk, right-wingers, but thoughtful conservatives. I think it's a very important part of the reading I do as well, obviously, as that of people of color. But I think that I do think that organizations, universities, et cetera, they are focused on being well led, of course, but I think they're also focused to some degree on the perception that they're, developing intellectual content that is feeding a different perspective. And I think Harvard has been in the forefront of that. I'm not going to weigh in on the merits of Claudine Gray or not. I don't know enough about it. I read McWhorter's piece, but I've also read pieces fiercely defending Harvard's choice there. So, but I think that, one of the things that gets lost in the conversations about it that are political is the legitimate desire organizations have to diversify at the top, not just in the mid ranks. And that, is probably one of the things that was happening there. And it's a legitimate desire to pursue. Mm-hmm. Harvard has done some extraordinary scholarship like this 1619 project. And, some of the people involved in it may have been very ideological, but that's a separate kind of issue. And, those presidents were being targeted because they did a pretty poor job of representing what they were trying to do in the congressional hearings. They walked into a trap. And there are all kinds of reasons I think that happened, especially having to do with how the law firm that was representing them prepped them for that particular conversation. But what happened was these activists went after them as typical DEI. Let's look at the president, McGill of University of Pennsylvania, who was the first one to get fired. It was like, she's only there because she's a woman. The MIT, Sally Kornbluth, But she's only there because she's a woman, if they, so there is this assumed uber competence among white males. It doesn't mean there haven't been some extraordinary white male leaders. Of course there have. But there have also been some pretty poor ones in organizations, but it's never identified that way. It's like, oh, well, he kind of screwed up, or, yeah, he took the company on the wrong path with that decision to pursue whatever it was. But there's a lack of skepticism about that inherently.
Well, you have a great sentence in today's Substack.
Uh-huh.
So I'll say the second half of which is companies, and I think you're sort of quoting or citing someone, companies routinely conflate overconfidence with competence in white males, especially those in leadership positions. And you mentioned, Jack Welch, who is revered, lionized as the CEO of the century, practically from last century. The parade, the clown car of Boeing executives who followed sort of Alan Mulally and did not do a good job, and example after example. Yeah, right, like that's where there should be skepticism. Like, oh, you're a white guy. Prove it to us that you didn't just get in through the old boys network.
Well, I agree with that strongly. And, Jack Welch, he did what he did. He moved GE from being a great manufacturing company to being a company that was dependent upon their finance branch, that was evaluated in the stock market as if it were a financial services firm during his tenure. That was part of what he was able to bring off. And then it blew up on his successors. And it's a tragic watching that company sort of be hollowed out and trying to recoup now. But, it's not, it's just assumed that, it's never, these guys get so much of the benefit of the doubt from people. And the minute a woman or a person of color comes into a position of leadership, the first mistake is, well, they must have gotten that position because they were. It's never, that these, as you'd say, this clown car of leaders that Boeing had starting in 1996 with Phil Condit, that these leaders were, where they were because of the support they had, or because basically they were, part of the old boys network, as you put it, and that they had benefited from that. So it's not really a smart way to evaluate leaders, through this lens of race. Even, if it's white guys, it's like these guys benefited from the old boys network. That quote you read about the companies, that organizations are particularly poor at spotting incompetence among white males, is really from Tommaso Chamorro, Premusic Chamorro. I always get those backwards. Premusic Chamorro, who is at Columbia and also at London School of Economics. And he has done these very, very large studies. And he feels that that's one of the biggest problems that companies have, that they're not good at spotting incompetence in white men. And that, why is that? And that penalizes not just women and people of color, but white men who are competent, because the companies are often dazzled by overconfidence, which is a huge problem. And a lot of the mistakes, if you look at a Boeing, if you look at HP, a lot of the mistakes that were made through overconfidence that people had in their own skills and their own brilliance and their own ability, to sell ideas that were essentially problematic.
So I kind of drop underneath the DEI conversation for a second, just to respond. So when you say that these organizations are bad at spotting incompetence in white men, one of the things I hear is that they're bad at spotting incompetence. And right, so like it's not as clear. Competence in leadership is not as clear as say competence in like, you know, the assembly line, right? If the engine comes to the end of the assembly line and the bolt falls off, then you can say, you know, someone screwed up. But so like, do we have the technology to assess leadership in any meaningful way, or is it because it's so amorphous that all this, you know, misattribution comes in?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And it does, yeah, exactly. If you make a mistake on assembly line, it shows up. But at a leadership level, you're dealing it, you know, to some degree, it's more amorphous, which is why really great leaders, people like Alan Mulally, will make it very tangible. I do want to say one thing. This idea is that they are particularly poor at spotting incompetence in overconfident white men. That's what Premusic Tomorrow's research showed. And there are fewer women or people of color naturally who are going to be overconfident because they haven't had that kind of support and that kind of endless affirmation of you're wonderful, oh, you're brilliant, etc. Let's put you on the cover like Jack Welch of Fortune magazine every other week and talk about, you know, the company as if it is you. So that kind of overconfidence is more characteristic of people, you know, who've come up with the kind of support of the Old Boys Network. So that's really where the problem is that overconfidence will tend to override more tangible evidence of issues.
Okay.
And
but I want to push back on that a little bit.
Okay.
Like when I was in school and I took a math test, like if I got a 72, my confidence made no difference. It seems like, yeah, there's a differential effect on different groups of people, but the underlying fact is like, are they good at, do we understand how to evaluate leaders? Is it just about, you know, the stock price in 2 years? Or is there a rubric? Like, you know, you and I belong to a networking group that kind of has a basic understanding of what leadership is, you know, led by the writing of Marshall Goldsmith and lots of others around, you know, being vulnerable, admitting your mistakes, inclusive, empowering others. Like, what's the bottom line sort of research on, like, are there behaviors that routinely translate into great leadership or good leadership or competent leadership, or is this the overconfidence problem a symptom of we have no idea what makes a good leader?
You know, I think that's a really interesting question. I know that I'm familiar with this human flourishing project at Harvard that's going on right now, which is trying to identify what primary factors create a culture in which people are most likely to flourish. That is, really realize their talents, feel that their work is satisfying and rewarding and sustainable. So that's an idea. They're looking at that so they can then assess, you know, how that happens in a team, how that happens in a unit, a division, and in an organization. And it usually comes down to the leader. It just does. If a team has a leader who is capable of listening, of demonstrating, of not disrespecting people, of treating people well, of being inclusive, then you're more likely to have a team that flourishes. But it's not always those people who are on track for leadership, because there are a lot of other concerns at the leadership level. I think that where the assessment of leaders often goes astray is this presumption that someone is a visionary or a big picture thinker, which puts a lot of pressure on an individual to sort of come up with things that are original and arresting and that may not necessarily be in the long-term interest of the organization. And that's, I've heard that for years, this idea of being a visionary. And often when I followed the auto industry. I won't say I studied it, but I followed the auto industry in the United States for many decades. And during its period of real struggles, that's what they were always looking for. They were looking for, the Roger Smith at General Motors, who was the guy who, his vision was robots and, moving to robotize basically everything, the teams, how teams were led, etc. So that was considered, a big picture idea. So that kind of thing, I think there's a real map and an overlap there with overconfidence. And I don't think that leaders are necessarily assessed based upon the actual attributes that develop an organization to be a place where people can in general flourish. I don't think, I haven't seen that, and a company will have a fantastic leader in that mode like Alan Mulally at Ford, and then turn around after that and look for leaders who, were very different in their philosophy and approach, but who had a big picture, a vision. Now they're finally, back to having someone more in the Alan mode at Ford. But that I find that really fascinating.
God, so many tangents I want to go on. Like you've just like thrown steroids on my ADHD. I want to have like 12 separate divergent conversations at the same time right now.
Yeah, it's that big picture, and this is where organizations fall into trouble. I call it, the Thermidor approach. In the French Revolution, they called July Thermidor, and they began renaming all the months. So the idea was it was going to be a whole new day. Everything was going to be different. And you find that routinely in organizations. This guy's putting his stamp on it. This leader is, changing the whole direction of the organization. I think that non-organic approach to organizational development is often highly problematic. And that's sort of at the root of what we're talking about.
When you describe it that way, I just have a vision of all the dogs here, like all the male dogs lifting their legs.
It's sort of like you want to create a big table where people can come and feel included. But when you have these revolutionary kind of like all new day approaches, you're basically flipping the table. You're flipping the people who are involved, but you have, a similar approach. And it doesn't, it doesn't make for an inclusive or reliable environment.
So one of the threads I wanted to follow was it's hard to agree upon a definition of success. Now, that's not true from a purely capitalist frame, right? Where we're talking about return on investment to shareholders. But, I was reading yesterday about Patagonia that restructured, that, every cent of their profits now is going to a fund that's now, being funneled towards climate positive activity. The founder and CEO for a long time, Yves Chenard, purposely didn't try to make as much money as possible. He sort of limited profits. In a capitalist world like that, that's less successful than had he, gone and done a North Face and had, triple or quadruple the revenue and profits. If we're talking about great leadership, we have to be talking at some point about something tethered to reality. What are the things that increasingly we should be looking at in terms of, is this organization a success besides everybody's getting rich?
Well, sustainability. I mean, that's the key here. That's what we're really talking about. When we talk about what happened at a company like GE, or what threatened to happen in the United States with our three, big three automakers. These were not sustainable business models. And when you look at, you're maximizing shareholder value, you're making a big splash in the stock market, but are you hollowing out your organization for where they will be in, 10 years from now? In those cases, yes, that was happening. So I think the key here is really, is this a sustainable approach? Is this sustainable development, sustainable growth? Patagonia is describing or defining sustainability in terms of the sustainability of our planet and our, ability to address those challenges. But I think that it, the short term focus, the quarterly focus of the financialized model makes it very hard, inherently hard, to build a sustainable model. And you see it, with hedge funds. I mean, this is, the biggest hedge fund, the most successful hedge fund. And then 3 years later, it's in bankruptcy, and, everybody's lost their job. And the founder, the guy who founded it, is out and, trying to raise more venture capital. That's not a sustainable model. And I don't think it has. I think that's become clear, but we're not really looking at it, and we're not understanding what an anathema that capitalism is not really, should not be dependent upon these very short-term goals and satisfying the stock market. And that's where we have one of the things we have to look at. We have to look at the fact that companies are often forced to make decisions that are not in their own best interest, and that the leaders who are smart recognize are not in their own best interest, in order to increase, quarterly returns. So I think that's a big problem, and it's not an inherently capitalistic problem. Capitalism, how that still is a model that works. It's just that financialism and that idea that really originated with Milton Friedman, that providing shareholder value is the only purpose of an organization, having nothing to do with its products, its services, its people, etc. That is the essence of short-termism.
Yeah, it's like Milton Friedman started reading Adam Smith and then got bored before he got to the chapters on moral sentiment.
Exactly. And, it was an idea and it was fine, but the way people got latched onto it as kind of a gospel and a rationale really, I think, harmed companies, particularly in the United States, where we don't have a counterbalance. In a country like Germany, where you have a significant representation of employees and even unionized employees on the boards, then you have other considerations. So you get a more inherently long-term approach. Here we've kind of gone with the Friedman thing, and I think that one of the things we're in the middle of now is a little bit of a backlash or a rethinking of that. And I'm seeing that, as you talk about, with the thoughtful conservative writers who are out there.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to reflect back is when you're describing the qualities of leaders who can create sustainable, inclusive, successful places to work, it reminds me a lot of women.
Yeah.
More so than men. And I'm recalling an essay I read. I was one of my first jobs out of school. I was a teacher in the Friends world, Quaker education.
Oh.
And I think it might have been a Peggy McIntosh essay, but I looked for it and I couldn't find it, so I might be just misremembering. But it was basically about teaching history and how we teach history in a way that ignores things like women doing dishes.
Yeah.
right? Like the warp and woof of everyday life is somehow not considered important, but it is the visionary. It's the one who's going to go break things, the person who's going to, put satellites up and send people to Mars. Um, and there's certainly a place for that, but it ignores the fact that the basis of sustainability, it's almost like, I've been a vegan for a long time, so in that world, like the hunters get all the glory, but the only reason they get to hunt is because the gatherers are keeping everybody fed. So they can go and do this risky thing, like go out and chase a big beast and come back and beat their chests and have a ceremony, when chances are they're going to fail, but they know there's food at home because the lady's got the tubers.
That is so right. You're so right, Howie. It's really fascinating, the extent to which that's happened. And this is something I really do have some information on. It's always fascinated me that women do have over the last 15 years started businesses at a higher rate than men, but they're much smaller businesses, and they are not capitalized at anywhere near the degree that the businesses men start are capitalized. And this is in part because the banks and the VCs are not as, they just have a harder time with women. And there have been studies done and lots of prep done for women to make the pitch for VCs. But what I've seen is that women often start businesses not because they want to assume a lot of debt and grow fast, break things, as you say, but grow fast and then sell it. They start a business because that's where they want to work. And they want to provide a good place to work for people that they've worked with, often other women who they feel aren't getting recognition. So it's a completely different business model. Margaret Heffernan wrote a brilliant book about it called How She Does It, about women who start their businesses and what their goals are and what motivates them. And it's a much more sustainable idea of motivation. I want to start something that I'm going to enjoy working in and that the people I hire are going to enjoy working in. This is a more sustainable model than how much capital can I get to grow the company as fast as I can with the idea of selling it. And the women don't necessarily want to sell it. So what Margaret found was a lot of these women said, I don't want to assume a lot of debt because then I cannot run the company in the way that I want to run it that fulfills the reason I've started it in the first place. So I thought that was really fascinating, and it speaks exactly to your point about that idea of building sustainable community and why and how that is so different than building a company that grows very fast and can be sold and that dazzles the market and, gets listed as quickly as possible, et cetera.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just reading this morning a book called The Thought Leader's Practice.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things you say, like, there's a difference between a practice like you and I have and a business, but we are told to build it like a business. And this is like one of the key distinctions is, do you want freedom or fulfillment?
Yeah.
Right. If you want the bit like, okay, I'll work hard, I'll put up with stuff, but in 3 years or 10 years, I'll sell and I'll be a multimillionaire and I can live on the beach and sip drinks with umbrellas. Versus, Sally Helgesen Inc. Sally Helgesen wants to keep doing what she's doing because it has an intrinsic inherent value and meaning and joy and purpose, as opposed to, I'm going to cash out. And so if you're not going to cash out, then none of your investors is going to cash out either. And so why would they invest?
That's a wonderful point. And I remember a group that I was part of that Marshall actually started of thought leaders, people who were in the field of leadership, who did research, who wrote books, et cetera. And there were a lot of very interesting people in it. And in the 90s, everybody was trying to figure out a way to cash out. And how were they going to do that? And who were they going to sell their intellectual property to? And most of those efforts actually just kind of blew up either they happened and they were very unsatisfying to the person. The person ended up getting ripped off, even losing the capacity or the ability to use their own name in their businesses going forward, et cetera. It was not a successful thing. And I'd always been allergic to the idea of starting a business because I had seen how that looked. And I thought, this is not what I want. I don't want to employ a whole bunch of people. I don't want to be responsible for 5 or 10 or 50 people's health insurance. And, keeping that idea of practice, I love that. And I think that's been lost, in the medical field. It used to be very much a practice. And not because of the doctors, but just because of the way the, insurance companies are run, it's become a business.
So another thing that I wrote down to talk to you about is this idea of like the visionary leader. It's okay if they like crash and burn because they're just going to get more money to do it again. But very often, not very often, but occasionally they'll succeed on some outlandish. And it reminds me of, I don't know if you've read Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets.
No.
It's a great book. She was I think a professor of something who quit to become a world champion poker player.
Oh, I've heard about her. Thinking in Bets. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah.
And her point is you don't judge a decision. And they said every decision is a bet, essentially. And it's because just as in poker, you don't know what you don't have all the information. So you're making a decision, you're taking an action based on incomplete information, playing the odds typically, and whatever information you can gather. So it's like you don't judge the quality of the decision by the outcome. You judge it on the merits of what was known at the time. And so when I see, go back to these very, very overconfident, typically white males, some of whom get it right.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get it right next time. In fact, it probably means that they're even more overconfident, less willing to look at disconfirmatory data or trends. And they become the more successful they become, the more dangerous in a way.
I think we're seeing that a lot in the Silicon Valley thing because there's been so much emphasis on, the genius. And there are geniuses. I mean, Steve Jobs, the way he ran Apple, his vision for Apple, this was genius at that level. It really was. And, it had all its consequences, et cetera. But there's this such a focus on genius that you'll get guys. I mean, Elon Musk was fired from PayPal. He kept trying to get PayPal to change its name to X. And, the idea that people were going to put all their money into a thing that, an X that looked like it was an X-rated movie was, something that the other people there, his partners, just said, absolutely not. So he got fired and he had lots of issues that were challenging. And this, was able to, put his name on Tesla. But, a lot of these guys, I mean, what's happened to Twitter is a perfect example of, just because you had a big success and everybody wrote about you and you became kind of famous and everybody thought of you as a genius at one thing doesn't mean that that's going to happen with something else. And yet, what happens from my perspective is that VC, more than organizations, is dazzled by overconfidence, absolutely dazzled by it, and willing to endlessly fund people, who have screwed up. I mean, look at the banks with Donald Trump, for God's sake. It's just problem after problem after problem, and bankruptcy and pulling out of this deal and, endless lawsuits, and yet willing to keep funding and funding and funding. So this is a problematic model.
So it always fascinates me when there's such a glaring inefficiency in a market that doesn't get addressed. Like you think of capitalism, like for all its flaws, it's kind of like nature. Like,
Yes.
it abhors a vacuum. And if someone can make a buck, but, it's sort of the Moneyball perspective, right? Like oh, there's an inefficiency. Someone's going to find it. Someone's going to exploit it. And yet there's so many cases where I think, I was in sort of food and nutrition and health for a long time thinking, what if you had an insurance company that, you know, paid for prevention rather than, the $1 million open heart surgeries after the third heart attack?
Right.
And yet it doesn't really exist. There's so much in place that's going to block that. And I think, like, why don't a bunch of people get together, create a VC fund that really looks at, Moneyball type numbers, like who is likely to succeed, what are the qualities of a leader, and funds sort of quiet women who aren't into a revolution but are just into, right? Like there's so much research about, like, all-star CEOs moving from one company to another and then failing because, I think maybe this is what you're saying, because they're bringing their own big brand as opposed to a quieter leader who's more into, like, how do we turn this institution into the best it can be rather than how do we remake it in my visionary image.
In my image. And, Boris Groysberg, who's at Harvard, I think he's both in the School of Education and the School of Business, wrote one of the most brilliant books I've read in this, certainly on this topic, called Chasing Stars, where he did a long-term longitudinal, I think it was over 10-year study of the most successful analysts on Wall Street and the portability of their skills, because these people move around all the time. They move constantly from one firm to the next, and they get a better deal here, then they get a better deal there. Sometimes they're at a place for a couple of years. And what he found is that, in fact, their skills were not very portable. They would have a huge success at one place, and then they'd get hired for a lot more money with bigger bonuses, et cetera, at another place, and it wouldn't translate. That the ones who stayed in place had much more success. And he said what they underestimated was the value of the support they got at the organization at which they were first successful. They couldn't see that because they believed it was them. They believed it was they themselves. Now, what Groysberg also found was that this was not true of the small number of women who were top analysts, that they were, in fact, very good at assessing the moves they made, and their skills turned out to be much more portable. There were more cases proportionately, or, in terms of, just their small representation of women who were able to successfully move their skills to another firm. So we wanted to find out what that was. His quantitative study wasn't revealing it. So they went and interviewed the women who had done this successfully and the women who hadn't done it. And what he found was they were much more concerned with what the actual experience at the place they were going would be, who they would be working with, who the leader was, what the culture was like, how it would support their desire to have a satisfying and rewarding career, as opposed to just, well, it's a no-brainer. They're paying me X more and they're going to give me a bonus of X million, which was mostly the assessment that the guys were making. So I thought that was really fascinating. So it's this whole idea of context and the desire to have a satisfying life. Now, by the way, I think this has become a much more widespread way of thinking among men in organizations. I see that, wanting to have a career that's inherently rewarding rather than just one that looks fantastic on paper and pays you very well. So I think that whole discussion we're in about purpose and flourishing and all is part of that. And it's a very good sign. And I happen to think it was to some degree influenced by women.
Well, it's, we hear a lot about, sort of grumpy people my age complaining about the young people
Yeah.
who, right, like,
Yes.
why don't, nobody wants to work anymore. Right,
Exactly.
which from the perspective of my children is, well, why would we work at your crappy company under your crappy leadership for crappy money? Like we want more than that from our work. We want to contribute, and we want it to be meaningful, and we want to be embedded in a nurturing culture, as well as, not just sort of slogging as an individual, waking up every day with my sword, cutting off heads, and then coming home to drag my ass into bed at night so I can get up and do it again tomorrow.
And this is why this younger generation is going to save us, because I think their values and, their alignment with the idea of having a satisfying life of contribution is one that's very strong. And really, exactly, I hear people my age all the time, oh, they don't want to work. Oh, they're so this, they're so that. They're exactly right for the environment right now. They have the skills, they have the attitude, they have the capability to flourish. I feel that very strongly. I see it in the political arena as well. So I'm fairly, because the work I do exposes me to so many younger people. I'm very optimistic, I have to say, despite all that's going on. I'm very optimistic about the future, because I think they're really on track for this, and that their values really reflect what is required to build a more sustainable model of how we do organizations. And yes, we have developed a form of capitalism that is less efficient than it should be. I mean, capitalism is good at efficiency. That's why it's always been the best system, but it's distorted by things like, financial reward and, a lot of the sort of golden parachute stuff that took off. So you get wildly outsized rewards at the top, even when you have a failing, even when the organization is failing, and the people at the bottom are suffering more and more and feeling less and less valued. So this is not an efficient way of running a capitalist organization, nor was it the classical way of doing it until, really starting in the late 80s when it began to change, maybe late 70s. But this is, this is what we have to get out. And I think that the imagination and the commitment of this younger generation to creating, again, careers that are rewarding and satisfying as individuals and sustainable, and that make a contribution to the world is what's gonna make this work.
All right. Well, on that high note, I know I have to let you go in a minute. Remind people where they can follow you and find you and consume more of your ideas and content, and be in touch.
Well, sure. And there are many resources on my website, sallyhelgesen.com, but I have
Okay,
been.
slow down and spell that for folks who are not going to read the show notes.
Okay. sallyhelgesen.com. My last name is spelled Helgesen. It'll come right up if you Google me. And I've been having a great time with All Rise, which is my Substack newsletter that I started about 2.5 years ago. And it's really created a kind of a community around some of the issues we've been talking about, which has been deeply satisfying. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, although I just saw this morning I've been blocked. I have no idea what that's about, but
well,
that will get resolved.
I'm sure it was for doing something good.
I think it was just a tech glitch. I don't, I tend to, but it may have been. It may have been, given where we are now.
Yeah. Well, Sally Helgesen, such a pleasure as always to talk to you. I hope we can do this more and more. And All Rise on Substack, sallyhelgesen.com on the web. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Howie. I always enjoy speaking with you so much.
Okay. Be well.